Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am here talking on behalf of Dr. Falendra Kumar Sudan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Jammu. I am going to talk about module Gender, Climate Adaptation and Climate Change Policy from Demography of Climate Adaptation. So students, we are going to discuss about the various aspects of discrimination against women linked to climate change in relation to both adaptation and mitigation. Women are among the most vulnerable groups to the impacts of climate change. The international climate negotiations are now starting to take up gender aspects of climate change. The ad hoc working group on longer-term cooperative action under the convention AWG-LCA, women are mentioned several times. For example, in providing support, priority should be given to particularly vulnerable populations, groups, and communities, especially the poor. Women, children, the elderly, indigenous people, minorities, and those suffering from disability. The results would be merely rhetorical if the fundamental reasons for women's as well as men's specific vulnerabilities are not analyzed and addressed properly. So, the present module aims to analyze the impacts of climate change on gender disparities, to describe the various aspects of discrimination against women linked to climate change in relation to both adaptation and mitigation, to provide guidelines to address the gender dimension of international climate policy. Gender inequality and climate vulnerability. The gender division of labor is one of the main factors of gender inequality. An unequal share of unpaid care work and other unpaid labor falls on women. In all countries, women spend significantly more time in unpaid work compared to men. For instance, in rural India, the unpaid women work amounts to more than 36 hours and their paid work about 9 hours a week, while men spend 41 hours for paid work and 3.5 hours for unpaid work. A significant part of unpaid work of women in developing countries revolves around natural resources, that is, collecting fuel and water, subsistence agriculture, and gathering food and fodder in forests. In South Africa, many women spend 2 hours to collect fuel and about 1 hour to collect water. The climate change reduces crop yields and the availability of wood and increases water scarcity. These natural resource dependent activities will be severely affected by climate change. Even if women have a full-time job, in countries such as Sweden, the extra time women spend on unpaid domestic work is several hours per week. For Swedish women, the ratio between unpaid and paid labor is 1.15, while for men it is 0.56. The impacts of climate change are likely to increase the unpaid work burden of women. These tasks are likely to be carried out at the expense of education or income generating activities. With increases in food prices and declines in subsistence production, food insecurity may lead to precarious situations. Another fundamental reason for higher vulnerability of women is the difference in incomes and economic resources for women and men. The proportion of women among the poor is substantially higher than men. In general, women's wealth level is dramatically lower. A trend of the expansion of female-headed households in both developed and developing countries may exacerbate the feminization of poverty. Besides, the uneven distribution of income within the household due to imbalances in power relationships might lead to hidden forms of female poverty. One main factor is the wage gap that exists in varying degrees all over the world. Women are paid less for the same work, and this gap seems to be persisting. For example, in Australia, the ratio of female to male income started to level out, but during the 90s, the ratio fell again until it reached early 1980 levels. Furthermore, the segregation of the gender in occupations has resulted in lower incomes for women who usually work in jobs that are less valued and lower salaried. Young women still tend to choose female occupations, while their share of engineering, manufacturing, and construction jobs is less than 25%. As a consequence of this, women will gain less from job opportunities created through investments in renewable energy. Even more worrying in terms of vulnerability is the huge gender gap in financial assets, land, and real property. The fundamental reason for this gap is the insecurity over or even the denial of land and inheritance rights, whether this is based on formal legal restrictions or customary rights or the lack of enforcement of legal provisions for equality. In Pakistan, for example, in 2001, women owned less than 3% of the plots, even though, in most cases, legal regulations allowed them to own land. Women and assets. Women are less likely than men to own almost every type of asset. The median value of assets held by women is always lower than that of their male counterparts. A smaller proportion of women own stocks, bonds, and other financial assets compared to men. Women are also less likely to hold retirement accounts, and a woman's pension is typically smaller than a man's. However, the access of women to markets and credit is limited. Women received less than 10% of loans compared to male smallholders. As a result, because of their scarcity of resources, women have fewer options for coping with or avoiding the impacts of climate change. Again, this holds true for women in both developing and industrialized countries. However, for women in the global south, situations that threaten survival are more likely to occur. Their informal rights to resources could disappear in time of scarce land resources, as there is likely to be increased competition over the control of land. Another factor is differences in power and the lack of representation and participation of women in public and private decision-making bodies. In national parliaments, less than 20% of the members are women. As far as national governments are concerned, the picture is similar. For instance, in countries of the European Union, 26% of senior ministers are women. Even in Sweden, the share of women among legislators, senior officials, and managers is only about one-third. Differing from common opinion, at the local level in Sweden, the situation is no better, as the bias is in a similar range. Only some 20% of the city councillors and less than 10% of the mayors are female. In many fields, even if women hold a majority of the jobs, as they do in education, the air gets thinner for women at higher levels of the hierarchy. For example, in Europe, less than one third of business leaders are female. While in the highest decision making bodies of the largest companies, their share goes down to about 10%. In energy companies, a core area for climate change policies, the proportion of women tends to be even lower. For instance, a proportion of 4% at the executive level in Germany. Thus, it is not surprising that women are also underrepresented among delegates of parties attending the United Nations climate session. The share of women during the last years varied between 25% and 30%, while women's proportion among heads of delegations was substantially lower with a quite large fluctuation. As for non-governmental organizations, the gender balance seems to be less skewed except for those of business groups. As can be seen, for example, from the number of postings in relevant list services, the efforts are being made among environmental NGOs to establish an equitable gender balance in working groups and committees. Would the outcome be different if more women were involved? There are some indicators that policies would receive increased attention. For example, a massive increase in renewable energy sources and far-reaching and strong measures to reduce overconsumption. There is evidence from surveys in various countries that women are less willing than men to accept risky technologies such as nuclear power and ocean fertilization. At the time of implementing climate policy at the community level, it is indisputable that the increased involvement of women would help them to better take their specific vulnerabilities and that for their entire families into consideration. Women and cultural patterns and social roles. The consequences of culture patterns and social roles which discriminate against women largely differ from country to country. It includes the constraints on access to information and education and restrictions on personal, social, and economic activities outside the home. It is frequently reported that early warnings, such as flood warnings in Bangladesh, have not reached women or have not been understood by them. In addition, both during and in particular after disasters, women are exposed to sexual harassment and violence, especially young women and girls, especially in temporary shelters and refugee camps. While men are at higher risk because of some cultural patterns, such as expectations of heroism, for instance, in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch in Central America, in most cases, women might be more at risk. There is heavily cited evidence that women experience more fatalities during floods, heat waves, and post-disaster difficulties. Neumayer et al., on basis of analysis of 4,600 natural disasters over a 20-year time span, provided evidence for the stronger decrease in the life expectancy of women than that of men due to these disasters. The biological differences could not explain the gender gap. Rather, the socio-economic status of women and social norms related to gender were found to be decisive factors. Women and biological differences. Besides gender-related causes, sex-related factors stemming from biological differences add to greater vulnerability of women. These include reproductive health issues, for instance, the need for sanitation during menstruation and after giving birth, constrained mobility during pregnancy, and higher nutritional needs during lactation, women are also more sensitive to heat stress. This was a factor leading to a high mortality of women during the 2003 heat wave in Europe, with the highest mortality rate among elderly women. In brief, the cumulative impact of these factors, such as gender divisions of labor, income inequalities, power relations, and culturally specific gender norms and roles, will lead to a larger number of women severely affected by the impacts of climate change. They will be exposed to greater climate-induced vulnerability compared to men. The women have fewer options and capacities to cope with climate variability. In specific patterns of migration, secondary effects might be seen. For example, male out migration, leaving women and the rest of their families behind in an even more precarious situation. In the long run, because of increased work burden of women for family care and livelihoods, they may have even less time for involvement and participation in community affairs. The girls may suffer from lower school enrollment and reduced educational opportunities, thus consolidating and aggravating the discrimination against women. Thus, the Human Development Report 2007-8 states the trade-offs forced upon people by climate shock reinforce and perpetuate wider inequalities based on income, gender, and other disparities. Gender and climate adaptation. In international negotiations, some of the factors discussed so far have now been acknowledged to an extent. The responses and remedies, however, are still in their infancy. This is reflected in National Adaptation Programs of Action, that is NAPAs. The least developed countries are needed to set up NAPAs to recognize priority activities and receive funding. The NAPAs are expected to organize a national and subnational consultative process, guided among other principles by sustainable development and gender equality. No further guidance, however, is given on how to operationalize these criteria. For instance, by providing methodologies for vulnerability assessments that are suited to detect gender bias and gender-specific vulnerabilities. The available NAPAs reveal that gender issues are not explicitly addressed when it comes to prioritizing adaptation projects. Gender is mainly understood as the participation of ministries in charge of equal opportunity or women's organizations in the consultations, however, without holding separate consultations with women. The consultations were held at various levels and efforts were made in selecting participants and in monitoring to achieve a balanced representation. Several countries have included gender equality or women's empowerment into their list of criteria. In NAPAs, such as those of Bangladesh, Guinea-Bissau, Lesotho, Malawi, Niger, and Uganda, women were identified as the most vulnerable group. Although many countries held consultations at the national level, only Samoa employed a method to recognize vulnerability at the community level. Applying the community vulnerability and adaptation tool, women's councils or women's committees and youth groups were also involved. However, in many NAPA processes, gender was barely mentioned during the elaboration and prioritization of projects. Only a very few projects were left that specifically addressed women's concerns. For example, in the NAPA of Burundi, women's empowerment rated low among various other criteria. In other countries, projects that survived the selection process included a specific action for female-headed households, among a package of other action measures such as empowerment of women through access to microfinance in order to diversify earning potential, and sensitization and awareness raising campaigns on climate change impacts on women related to three conventions on biodiversity, desertification, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Undoubtedly, women will gain from many of the projects. However, it seems that NAPAs fall short to address both gender aspects as a whole and the specific vulnerabilities of women in a comprehensive way. It is pointed by the gender experts that there is no gender concern in the programs prioritized in the NAPA. There is a wealth of measures that would respond to specific vulnerabilities of women and girls, and moreover would benefit men and boys too. While these appear to be simple and straightforward measures, they do not receive proper attention simply because men do not suffer to the degree that women do, for example, from a lack of proper sanitation facilities. Gender and climate mitigation. The gender dimension is completely absent in core issues of climate negotiations other than adaptation, mitigation, technology transfer, and financing. However, gender roles and division of labor, access to and control over resources, as well as gendered attitudes and consumption patterns are also very likely to play a role in mitigation. The causes of climate change also have a gender dimension. The emissions are related to consumption, and higher incomes of men allow for more consumption. Therefore, greenhouse gas emissions generated by men might be higher. This estimation is true for single-person households in European countries, in spite of age, social status, and absolute income levels. The carbon footprint of men, calculated from their expenditures in different consumption categories, was considerably higher than that of women, mainly because of the use of car. Gender differences are most visible, particularly in the transport sector. For example, the preferences when purchasing a vehicle. In Germany, men pay attention to comfort, design, technical innovations, and branding, and women to costs, fuel consumption, and environmental acceptability while purchasing a car. Women also consider the intensity of car use and the disposition to switch to less carbon-intensive transport modes. Moreover, the care work done by women has impacts on their mobility patterns, creating the need for gender-sensitive transport planning. If climate policy is focusing on fiscal instruments such as taxation and emission trading, it will lead to higher energy prices. The economically disadvantaged groups, such as women, are penalized directly. The energy costs make up disproportionately high share of poor households' expenditures since they often live in rented apartments lacking reasonable energy efficiency standards. Noteworthy gender differences in attitudes towards climate policies and measures can be observed in many countries. In general, women are more concerned about the environment and climate change which fits very well into their greater risk awareness, and they tend to favor changes in consumption patterns and lifestyles rather than technological approaches. Gender aspects are not involved in climate policies and measures only, but also in their impacts. For example, in the businesses that benefit from climate policy, such as construction and the production and installation of low carbon technologies, women hold a minority of jobs. In Germany, where renewable energy sources are a booming sector due to the favorable national policy framework, the average proportion of female workers in renewable energy companies is about 25%, and in vocational training, it is only slightly higher. The share of women among energy advisors is less than 20%. There is also gender bias in job opportunities. This underrepresentation may result in neglect of women's needs for adequate information. It will constrain their participation in decision making and implementation in the energy sector. In brief, gender mainstreaming in climate mitigation policies and measures are highly desirable. In this context, policy regulation would be preferred to market-based instruments to avoid disadvantages for women due to their low incomes and limited access to markets. Climate and gender mainstreaming. Has gender mainstreaming worked so far? Gender mainstreaming implies integrating equality between men and women into all policies and activities and into every stage of policymaking. This term, gender mainstreaming, was adopted in European Commission policy to promote equality between women and men in 1996 after the Beijing Platform for Action introduced gender mainstreaming. Although the mainstreaming approach is working fairly well for social policies, it is actually not fully implemented in environment and energy policies. This is not surprising, as these are policy areas where the gender aspects are not often obvious and thus need careful analysis. In these areas, women are underrepresented, which makes things even worse if the gender aspects are not explored. In the climate policy of industrialized countries, mainstreaming of climate considerations has not been achieved at all. The counterproductive subsidies benefiting harmful fossil fuel industries and the call for massive economic growth to counterbalance increasing national debts are growing. However, the huge potential for emissions reductions from energy efficiency, which would require consideration of climate issues for any investment, remains untapped. The climate policy at the international level has not even pointed that mainstreaming efforts would be more useful than merely relying on singular projects, either for climate policy itself or for gendering it. The climate policies are not yet fully established. In all situations, the first step at international level is urgently required to acknowledge the need for gender mainstreaming, and based on national and local experience, capacity building on gender and climate mainstreaming must be promoted. Making use of available knowledge. In order to address gender issues in climate policy, available methods and tools can be adapted. Gender analysis is imperative for climate mainstreaming. Actions must rely on women in grassroots organizations, building on their capacities and knowledge of the specific context, without increasing their work burden. Women are powerful agents of change. This would also build on the existing coping strategies of women to address climate variability and disaster by, for example, switching to drought resistant crops, using traditional medicines and healthcare, and organizing collective action. The methods and tools are obtainable from development policy or other policy fields that can easily be adapted to suit climate policy, such as gender impact assessments and gender budgeting. Another important field of action is access to information, education, and capacity building. UNFCCC through Article 6 covers this, which requires parties to promote and facilitate public awareness and participation, education, and training. This is an important area for both adaptation and mitigation. However, the efforts under Article 6 play only a minor role in the international process and have not yet been gendered. These activities are first steps which offer entry points to reduce vulnerability and are a precondition for meaningful contributions. Gender sensitive communication refers to the contents and topics that are to be transmitted and whether they meet the needs of women and men, considering, for example, differences in education or even illiteracy. In addition, it requires suitable media and communication channels and gender sensitive and inclusive language and design. Finally, it should also contribute to conquering the limitations of gender roles and to avoiding gender stereotypes. So students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. To sum up, we can say that the first step in integrating gender equality issues would be improving the participation of women in climate policy and the endorsement of the gender strategy. To attain gender justice within climate justice, societal structures and patterns that perpetuate injustices have to be addressed. As noted, the challenges of climate change and gender injustice resembles each other. They require whole system change, not just gender mainstreaming, but transforming gender relations and societal structures. Not just technical amendments to reduce emissions, but real mitigation through awareness and change of unsustainable lifestyles and the current ideology and practice of unlimited economic growth. Not the perpetuation of the current vision of resources and labor, but a responsible cooperative approach to achieving sustainable and equitable societies. To support addressing gender issues in international climate policy, two main lines of argument are put forward. First, it is clear that emissions will inevitably rise with the growing population. However, the size of the effect is doubtful. The population growth is taking place mainly in the developing countries with very low per capita emissions. Second, there is a large unmet need for family planning, and some advocates hope to revive the attention of the donors if this is connected to climate change. But as long as industrialized nations do not demonstrate that they are willing and capable of achieving deep emissions cuts, initiating a discussion on population within the international climate negotiations appears to be neither sufficient from an ethical point of view nor wise from a tactical perspective. It is clear that an integrated climate policy regarding gender issues and climate change require mainstreaming, and as a consequence of which double mainstreaming is required to integrate climate into all relevant sector policies and day-to-day administrative procedures, while simultaneously integrating gender aspects at all the stages. That's all with this lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.